It has been 1 year since Hong Kong's worst political crisis began. It began in earnest with a mass march on the 9th of June 2019. And now, a year later, Hong Kongers have returned to the streets for a reminder that many thorny issues, including the demonstrations' demands for greater official autonomy, still remain unresolved. The streets are crowded again. Hundreds are demonstrating, chanting defiant slogans and waving banners as they mark the anniversary of the extradition bill protest. Last year, on the 9th of June, more than 1 million people took to the streets of Hong Kong opposing the extradition bill drafted by China. And today, the same protesters are facing brutal police force and restrictions due to the coronavirus pandemic as they oppose China's new national security law. Protesters in Hong Kong have also taken inspiration from the protests in the United States over the brutal killing of George Floyd. While some demonstrations called for independence of Hong Kong, the rest of the gathering held up placards which read, "We can't breathe, free Hong Kong," and sang the country's national anthem, "Glory to Hong Kong." In 2019, the pro-democracy protests that had rocked Hong Kong was met with brutal police force. The city's police troops shelled tear gas, fired water cannons, and also beat up protesters who spoke up against China. But the protests continued and they continued to grow, and human rights activists fearing Chinese hegemony were also successful in creating a pro-democracy movement, which eventually forced Carrie Lam to withdraw the extradition bill. Hong Kong's leader, Carrie Lam, delayed that introduction of the bill, but anti-China demonstrations continued to create chaos in Hong Kong. Despite the withdrawal of the bill, protesters called for an investigation into police brutality and have also demanded a complete end to Beijing's efforts to undermine human rights in Hong Kong. A few months ago, the protests which were stopped due to coronavirus pandemic has once again erupted of late with Beijing's new move to impose national security legislation on Hong Kong. The legislation aims to tackle the alleged secession, terrorism and foreign interference in Hong Kong. Though the details of the law largely remain unclear, democracy activists fear legislation could erode the city's freedom. Joining us on this broadcast now is WION's Richard Kimber, who joins us from Hong Kong. Richard, exactly 1 year ago, 1 million people marched on the streets of Hong Kong. And given the sheer percentage of people in a particular area that were protesting, the Hong Kong protests were one of the most heavily participated protests by a percentage of population in an area. So it just showed the support that movement had. 1 year on, what has changed in Hong Kong? Because now Hong Kongers are raising their voice against the national security law by China.
Well, that's right. And just an hour ago, the street behind me that you can see was again full of people. And for a moment, it really felt like last year as the streets were again being filled with demonstrations. That only lasted this time for about 15 or 20 minutes as police moved in very quickly to disperse that crowd, telling everybody that this was an illegal gathering, that because of coronavirus restrictions, no permit has been issued for protests of this kind at the moment. And so police very quickly, in large numbers and many in riot gear, dispersed that crowd, and people then spread into all the side streets near where I'm standing here. Now, I mean, relative to the mass marches that we saw last year, that kind of thing, we've not seen anything like that again, although it's clear from the protest organisers that that's what they're aiming for, to try and show their opposition to this national security bill. It's very difficult for them to do that at the moment because, as I say, there are coronavirus social gathering restrictions in place, and that means the police are not issuing permits for those types of gatherings. So as soon as the event happened today to mark that one-year anniversary, the police moved in very quickly, told people this was illegal, and people very quickly then dispersed. So we didn't see anything like it, but for just 10 or 15 minutes it was really the same scene all over again.
Right, so but we saw the power of those protests, isn't it? Carrie Lam was forced to put that extradition bill on hold. What's the status of that bill now? And you were mentioning that there were some protests today as well in Hong Kong. Could you just elaborate on that?
Yes, well, firstly, as you asked about the extradition bill, when that was withdrawn last year, eventually, after months of protest, Carrie Lam made it clear that it was not only completely withdrawn, but there was no intention to resuscitate that bill, is how it got described in the local media here. That was effectively, as she put it in her final statement on the matter, she said the bill is dead. So that's really in the past, and for protesters it was seen as a victory ultimately because their large marches resulted in that happening. But this time, very different set of circumstances. This new bill, the national security law, is not being effectively introduced and pushed through by the Hong Kong government. This has been introduced by Beijing. And although the Hong Kong government has stressed very clearly only yesterday in a big webinar series to try and communicate better to the public that this is necessary, that China does this rather than Hong Kong doing it, and it's also, the government said yesterday, to make any doubts clear on this, it's also perfectly legal for China to do this according to the basic law arrangement that was set up when Hong Kong was handed back to China. But despite those reassurances from the government, people are very, very angry about this new bill. But there's a real sense here that no amount of protest is likely to make any difference because, as I say, this is not a Hong Kong government decision, really. This is a Beijing decision, and there's no sign here that Beijing will back down. So this bill is likely to come into effect by September. And the only thing that's not really clear is how much will protesters be able to continue their marches against this bill when it becomes perhaps clearer and clearer that there will be no backing down on this issue.
Richard Kimber, thank you so much for joining us and getting us that live report from Hong Kong as the city marks 1 year of pro-democracy protests.